not just a story about legacy. This is about a life built on a silence that never ended. A silence that started the moment a father's voice was permanently erased. Because while the world kept replaying Biggie's lyrics, celebrating his genius, immortalizing his name, there was one person who never even got to hear that voice speak to him directly, and that changes everything. The truth is, people love the myth. They love the money, the fame, the idea that being born into hip-hop royalty guarantees a golden life. But what if that entire image is a distraction? What if behind the velvet ropes and flashing cameras, there's a reality so emotionally hollow that no amount of success can ever fill it? That's where this story begins, not with fame, but with absence. Total, irreversible absence. Christopher Wallace Jr., CJ Wallace, entered this world already surrounded by greatness, already stamped with a name that carried weight before he could even speak. But here's the detail that most people skip over too quickly: the timeline. 4 months. That's all he had. 4 months and 10 days before everything changed forever. Before a black SUV rolled through Los Angeles in the early hours, before bullets tore through a legacy that was still being written, before a father became a ghost in his own son's life. And let's pause right there, because that's not just tragedy, that's timing so cruel it feels almost designed. Too short to remember, too early to understand, too permanent to ever escape. Now think about the contradiction. The entire world claims Biggie. They quote him, study him, argue about him, build careers dissecting his verses. His presence never really left culture. But CJ, he grew up without even a single real memory. Not one. No voice, no laughter, no moment that he could call his own. So what happens to a child who grows up watching strangers mourn someone he never truly knew? Does that grief even belong to him? Or does it feel borrowed, secondhand, stitched together from other people's emotions? And that's where things start getting complicated. Because CJ didn't just lose a father, he inherited a legend that never sleeps. A legend that shows up in documentaries, anniversary tributes, playlists, murals, interviews. Everywhere. Imagine being a kid and realizing that millions of people have a stronger emotional connection to your father than you ever could. That every year, the world revisits his life like it's a public ritual, while you're still trying to understand what it even means to miss someone you never met. That's not normal grief. That's something heavier, something that lingers differently. But to understand that weight, you have to go back further. Back to Brooklyn. Back to the streets that shaped Christopher Wallace long before the fame, before the suits, before the flashing cameras. Because Biggie wasn't just a rapper, he was a force. A storyteller who turned pain into poetry, chaos into rhythm, survival into art. And when his demo reached Sean Combs, it didn't just open a door, it ignited an explosion. Ready to Die didn't just succeed, it redefined everything. It was raw, unapologetic, brutally honest. And suddenly, Biggie wasn't just rising, he was dominating. But success doesn't exist in isolation. It attracts attention. It builds rivalries. And in the 90s, that rivalry turned into something darker. The East Coast versus West Coast tension wasn't just music, it was energy, ego, territory, pride. And when Tupac Shakur was killed in September 1996, the atmosphere shifted. It thickened. It became unpredictable, dangerous, and just 6 months later, history repeated itself in a way that still feels unresolved. Because here's the uncomfortable question nobody can answer cleanly. Was Biggie aware of how close everything was to collapsing? Was he sensing the danger, or did it all happen too fast? Because while all of this chaos was unfolding publicly, privately, he had just become a father again. And people close to him say something changed, that he wanted more, that he was thinking beyond the streets, beyond the music, beyond the image. That fatherhood meant something real to him. But then, silence. A car pulls up, shots fired, 4 bullets, and just like that, a voice that defined a generation is gone, pronounced dead, 24 years old. And while the world exploded in grief, while headlines screamed and albums sold and tributes poured in, somewhere in that same moment was a baby who would grow up never knowing what was taken from him. And that's where the real story begins, not with the death, but with what came after. Because losing someone on is one thing. Growing up in the shadow of someone the world refuses to let go of, that's something else entirely. And the deeper you look into CJ Wallace's life, the more it starts to feel like this wasn't just a loss, it was a life shaped by something that never truly ended. And the question is, what does that do to a person over time? And just when you think the story couldn't get heavier, it shifts again, because growing up without a father is one thing, but growing up inside a legacy that never stops speaking is something far more suffocating. Every milestone CJ Wallace reached didn't just belong to him, it echoed. First day of school, the world saw Biggie's son. First appearance on screen, not CJ, but Biggie's bloodline. Every achievement came with a shadow attached, a silent comparison nobody ever said out loud, but everyone was thinking. And here's the real tension: how do you build your own identity when the world has already decided who you are before you even get the chance to define yourself? Because CJ tried, quietly, deliberately, almost cautiously. Acting roles, creative projects, business ventures, each step felt less like ambition and more like negotiation. Negotiation with expectation. Negotiation with memory. Even when he stepped into the role of his own father in that biographical film, it wasn't just acting, it was something deeper, something almost unsettling. Imagine embodying a man you've never met, speaking like him, moving like him, recreating moments that the world remembers but you never lived. That's not just performance, that's reconstruction. That's building a relationship out of fragments and hoping it feels real enough to hold on to. But here's where the pattern gets even more revealing. CJ didn't become a rapper, and that decision, it says more than most people realize. Because if there was ever an easy path handed to him, that was it. The industry would have welcomed it, the audience would have demanded it. But he stepped away. Why? Because some shadows are too large to stand inside. Because competing with a ghost isn't ambition, it's pressure disguised as opportunity. So instead, he moved differently. He experimented with sound. He reinterpreted his father's music through entirely different genres, almost like he was trying to connect without copying, honor without becoming. And still, the shadow stayed. Because legacy isn't just about art, it's about responsibility. CJ didn't just inherit a name, he inherited an empire that kept growing even after death. Streaming numbers rising, licensing deals expanding, the estate evolving into something far bigger than what existed in 1997. And on paper, it looks like power, wealth, stability. But here's the uncomfortable truth: money can preserve a legacy, but it cannot recreate a relationship. It cannot replace guidance. It cannot fill silence. And for someone like CJ, that silence has been constant, permanent, untouched by success. But then, just when it seems like he's navigating it all on his own terms, something else enters the story: controversy. Allegations, lawsuits. Suddenly, the narrative shifts again, pulling him into something darker, something public, something messy. And here's where the situation becomes almost eerily symbolic. The same industry, the same environment, the same legacy network that built his father's name now becomes the setting for a completely different kind of battle. Not creative, not celebratory, defensive, legal, reputational. And you have to ask, why does it always circle back? Why does everything connected to this name seem to carry weight beyond the surface? Because this isn't just about one case or one accusation. It's about the pattern, the way CJ's life keeps intersecting with the past in ways that feel unavoidable, as if the story never really ended in 1997, as if it just changed form. And here's the part that hits the hardest, the part most people don't sit with long enough. CJ is now older than his father ever was. Let that sink in. He has lived more years than Biggie did, experienced more time, made more decisions, faced more consequences, and yet everything he knows about his father is still secondhand. Stories, interviews, lyrics, fragments. Imagine surpassing someone in life, but never catching up to them emotionally, never being able to ask a question, never getting an answer. That's not just sad, it's unresolved. Because at the center of all of this, the businesses, the projects, the headlines, the controversies, there's still a simple, uncomfortable truth that refuses to disappear. A son grew up without his father, while the entire world refused to let that father fade away. And no matter how much CJ builds, no matter how much he creates or defends or transforms, that absence doesn't shrink. It just becomes quieter, more internal, more invisible to everyone watching from the outside. And maybe that's the real story nobody wants to confront. Not the fame, not the money, not even the controversy, but the idea that some losses don't evolve into closure. They just stretch across time, shaping everything silently, influencing every decision without ever announcing themselves. And if that's true, then the story of CJ Wallace isn't finished. It's still unfolding, still shifting, still carrying questions that don't have clean answers. Because after everything, after 29 years, after all the growth, all the pressure, all the public attention, the one thing that never changed is the one thing he never had. And the deeper you think about that, the more unsettling it becomes. Because what does a life built around a legend really look like when the person behind that legend was never there to guide it?